Hey there, Sam. And now it's time to implement the two-factor authentication. Now, first thing that you'll notice is that this feature accepts an array of options in its argument. And currently, there's only one option in here where Laravel has set a confirm password option to true. In summary, if we set this option to true, Laravel will provide additional security by prompting the user to re-enter the password when they want to set up their two-factor authentication. For now, let's take a look at the routes that this feature has added to our app. We'll go to our terminal and run php artisan route list. And now, as you can see here, we have a delete two-factor authentication endpoint and a post two-factor authentication endpoint. The post endpoint is for the user to enable two-factor authentication, and the delete endpoint is for the user to disable two-factor authentication. We also have a get endpoint for the user to retrieve their two-factor QR code, where they can scan the QR code in their favorite authenticator app on their phone as part of the setup. Now we also got the post endpoint and get endpoint for the recovery codes. The post endpoint is for the user to regenerate the recovery codes, and the get endpoint is for the user to display their current recovery codes. And finally, we also have this post endpoint to the two-factor challenge route. This is the route where the user will send the two-factor authentication code on their phone to our app, and Laravel will verify the code behind the scene. Alright, let's bring everything back together and go through the whole two-factor authentication setup process and verification process. So after the user has logged in, if they want to set up two-factor authentication, they'll send a post request to the two-factor authentication endpoint. And if we have set the confirm password option to true, our app should prompt the user to re-enter the password and send a post request to the user confirm password endpoint. Otherwise, the setup for two-factor authentication will fail. Once 2FA is enabled, our app should send a GET request to the QR code endpoint to retrieve a two-factor QR code from Laravel Fortify. And then the user can proceed to scan the QR code in their Authenticator app. Once the two-factor authentication is set up successfully, our app should send a GET request to retrieve the user's recovery codes. If the user is not happy with the current recovery codes, they can send another post request to the recovery codes URL to regenerate a new set of recovery codes. And now, at this point, the user should be good to go. So the next time when they want to log in, right after they have entered their credentials, they should also send a post request to the two-factor challenge endpoint with the two-factor code from their Authenticator app. And if for some reason the user decided to disable two-factor authentication, they simply need to send a delete request to the two-factor authentication endpoint here. And that's basically the workflow of two-factor authentication in Laravel Fortify. And now, let's dive into the code right away. First of all, let's talk about the confirm password option here. As I mentioned just now, if we set this to true, Laravel Fortify will force the user to confirm their password when they want to set up their account with two-factor authentication. But how does this thing work behind the scene? To answer this question, let's dive into the source code of Laravel Fortify. We will open the routes file, and this is where Laravel Fortify defines all of its endpoints. We'll go to the two-factor authentication section. And as you can see here, the code is very easy to read and understand. The first if statement here is simply checking if the two-factor authentication feature is enabled. And we will register the routes only if it is true. What we're interested in here is the two-factor middleware variable here. What it is doing is checking if the confirm password option is true or not. If yes, the middleware will contain the authentication guard and password confirm. Otherwise, it will just be the authentication guard. And then Laravel Fortify went ahead and applied this middleware to the rest of the routes registered down here. So the user has to confirm their password when they attempt to enable or disable two-factor authentication or get a two-factor QR code, and also getting and regenerating the recovery codes. And now, here's another question. How does the password confirm middleware work? To answer this, we'll need to go back to our kernel class. And we see that the confirm password middleware is mapped to the require password class. And we'll go to the handle method of the require password middleware class. We can see that it is simply running a function called should confirm password to check if the user has confirmed the password or not. And inside the function, what it really is doing is getting a key in the request session called password confirm at, which is a timestamp when the user last confirmed their password. And we subtract it from the current time to determine whether if the user needs to reconfirm the password again by comparing against the password timeout property. And how would the user confirm the password? The answer lies inside the confirm password route. Let's go back to the Fortify routes file and we'll look inside the controller of the password confirm route. And as you can see in the logic, once the password is confirmed, Laravel simply set a new key called password confirm at inside the request session with the value of the current time. And this value in the session will be put forward for future use, for example, in the confirm password middleware. So hopefully that makes sense. You should now have a better understanding on how these methods and functions connected together. Alright, now let's go ahead and test the two-factor authentication workflow. First thing first, we'll go to our terminal and list down all the routes. And then we'll go to Postman and log into our app. Once we're logged in, the first thing we want to do is to enable two-factor authentication. And we can do that by sending a post request to user/two-factor authentication. Whoops, we got an error because we have enabled the confirm password option. So we first need to confirm our password by sending a post request to user confirm password. And I have also forgotten one more thing. In order to get two-factor authentication to work, we also need to go to our user model and get our user model to use the two-factor authenticable trait. And now let's go back to Postman. We will send a post request to the confirm password endpoint. And the request body should accept the current user password. Let's click on the send button and it works. And now let's go back to enable our two-factor authentication. And this time we get a status code of 200, and that means we have successfully enabled two-factor authentication. Great! And now let's try to get a two-factor QR code. I'll send a GET request to this endpoint. And in the response body, we get an SVG element. And in the front end, we're supposed to take this SVG element and render it in our browser for the user to scan it in their Authenticator app. And unfortunately, Postman cannot render this SVG element. Alright, let's move on. Next, we'll try to get all the recovery codes by sending a GET request to the user two-factor recovery codes endpoint. And in the response body, we get an array of recovery codes that looks sort of like gibberish. And in the front end, we should prompt the user to keep these recovery codes in somewhere safe. Next, we'll try to regenerate a new set of recovery codes by sending a post request to the same URL. And we get a 200 response with an empty body. We should have get a new set of recovery codes by now. Let's send another GET request to retrieve our recovery codes again. And we get a new set of recovery codes. Great! And just one note here, any given user can only have one set of recovery codes at one time. So that means if we keep calling the GET request to fetch the recovery codes, we will always get the same result. Alright, let's move on. Next, we'll try out the two-factor challenge endpoint. In Postman, we'll send a post request to this endpoint, and this endpoint is expecting the request body to contain either the two-factor authentication code from our Authenticator app or one of our recovery codes. I did not use an Authenticator app in this demonstration, so I'll go ahead and use one of my recovery codes. Let's send a request. And we get an error saying that this route is not found. Now this happens because currently we're logged in. Laravel Fortify will not allow us to do the two-factor challenge while we're still logged in. So let's go ahead and call the logout endpoint. And now we should have successfully logged out. And now if we go ahead and call the challenge endpoint again, we see another error saying that our authentication code is invalid. Why is that? Because in order to do a challenge, first we'll need to try to log ourselves in. In a typical web app, the user will only do the two-factor authentication challenge right after they have successfully logged in. So here we should really log ourselves in before doing the two-factor challenge. Let's send a post request to the login endpoint, and in the response body, we see a field called two-factor set to true. The front end can use this value to determine whether to prompt the user to enter the two-factor authentication code or not. And now we're logged in, but we haven't done the two-factor challenge. And if we try to call any endpoint in our app, we should get an error. And as expected, we got a 401 error saying that we're unauthenticated. Okay, now let's try to do the two-factor challenge. We'll send a post request to the two-factor challenge endpoint, and we see a 204 success code with an empty body. And that means we should be in by now. Let's send a GET request to try and fetch all of our recovery codes again. and we no longer see the unauthenticated message, but instead we see an error telling us to confirm our password again. And the reason is because we're now logged into a new session. And in this new session, we haven't confirmed our password yet. So let's go ahead and do that. And once we have confirmed our password, let's try to refresh the recovery codes again. And we get a success response. But one thing to note here is that we got ourselves a new set of recovery codes. This is intentional because for security reason, if the user used their recovery code to log in, that means the two-factor authenticator could be compromised. And Laravel Fortify will issue the user a new set of recovery codes, just to start fresh. And in the front end, we should really show the user this new set of recovery codes and prompt them again to keep them safe. Alright, lastly, we'll test our final endpoint, which is to disable two-factor authentication. We will send a delete request to the user two-factor authentication endpoint, and we get a success response. And that's about it. That's a lot of information, but it is everything that you need to know to work with Laravel Fortify. Have a go by yourself and just play around with this endpoint until you're comfortable with them. Key takeaway for this lesson: we need to use a two-factor authenticatable trait in our user model in order for two-factor authentication to work properly. The confirm password option will force the user to confirm their password when setting up 2FA. Laravel will issue the user a new set of recovery codes if they log in using their recovery code. That's it for now, and I'll see you again in the next video. If you enjoyed the content of this video, don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and the bell icon for more content to come. It will really help me out. Thanks for the support.